You're listening to Queering Premodern Asia, a limited series in Season 5 of the Nuances podcast. This narrative series features discussions with queer Asian co-hosts and scholars that will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about queerness, love, and premodern life in Asia. I'm your host and producer Lazu. I'm a cis, straight, Chinese-American woman who spent over a year researching and developing this series. I'm excited to be joined by my guest co-host for today's episode, Izat El Amoor.
Hello, my name is Izat El Amoor. I'm a queer Palestinian citizen of Israel, and I study LGBTQ issues in the SWANA region.
Content warning, this limited series explores historical contexts of love, gender, sexuality, and cultural norms. Exploration of those themes should not be deemed as an endorsement of those practices. It was a different time with different norms. This information is for entertainment purposes only. Mature themes may be explored. Today's episode includes mention of invasive medical examinations, pornography, transgenerational relationships, and violence against queer folks. Listener discretion is advised. For references, show notes, and more ways to listen and support, go to nuancespod.com. You can also follow us on social media at nuancespod. Episode 8. For the record. If you walk around any schoolyard, you might find initials and hearts engraved on tree trunks. Around the city, you will likely come across some etching to the effect of, "So-and-so was here," or "I love blank." From the earliest cave drawings to inebriated writings decorating any bar's bathroom stalls, to the padlock-laden bridges in Europe, to the continued oral traditions of our ancestors, we humans seem to have a need to mark our presence, a deep desire to tell other humans we'll never meet that we were here. Whether or not we fit the norm, we want to let them know we existed and we loved. Even when it was dangerous to be who we are, we found creative ways to color outside the lines. We found our people. We resisted in major or minor ways. History is often taught with a single or maybe two points of view. It's drawn from official archives, perhaps. But just as we have so many diverging opinions about everything today, it is very likely that this was the case throughout history. It's just that not all those opinions were ever documented in the way that history tends to be. This episode is about official records and the abundant unofficial records. The stories told in the books and the ones between the lines. The norms that were imposed and the ways they failed to materialize. Throughout this series, you've heard stories you've probably never heard before, and you might be wondering, why is that? Well, part of it is that a lot of the research is relatively new. Traditionally, history was its own isolated thing. Literature was its own thing. Gender studies was its own thing and mostly focused on women. But increasingly, some of the most interesting research is combining different fields and different approaches together. You can get to questions like, how do architecture and gender shape each other? How might one do a queer reading of the poem Hua Mulan? How did the shift from nomadic to sedentary lifestyles change the role of women? History isn't just about historical records. We can get pretty interesting information from poetry, literature, art, all kinds of other artifacts. Sure, they may not tell you this person was in love with this person and they lived in this town on this date, but they could tell you that it was possible for this person to fall in love with a person like this one during that time. And whether or not they could be together, it was at least possible to write about this dream that they might have had. We started this series with stories from the official history records in China, which had dedicated chapters documenting the male favorite of each emperor. Out of 24 of these Chinese classics, 23 had this special chapter dedicated to the male favorites. The last one did not have this chapter because, as we heard in episode 6, after losing the Opium Wars, Chinese culture made a drastic shift to abandon everything that was considered traditional Chinese values that may have contributed to their defeat. And that included male-male love as a norm. Some popular books featuring male-male love stories were banned, others were revised. So I asked Professor Chun Wu, who teaches Chinese literature at the University of Hong Kong, why they weren't completely erased from the official histories. Her answer? It was impossible. Everyone knew about them.
That's not possible because in China, there is official history. No one there to realize it. Too common. Everyone knows it. But because it's very classical, so not common to read it in full. That's why in 20th century, people just don't mention it. Well, it's remain invisible. Yeah. But all Chinese literature, like Story of Stone, it's great novel. They are mentioned a lot of homosexual love. And the Jinping Mei, the lotus in the golden vase, the story is a heterosexual love, but it also have same-sex love. It's not like you need to check any rare book you found it in.
So it seems like there's power in numbers, right? If everyone knows about it, then it can't be erased. While it wasn't to the same extent, male-male love was also documented in official histories of Korea, Japan, Vietnam, as we've heard in previous episodes. Some of those stories came from the Samguk Yusa, the veritable records of Joseon Dynasty, the great annals of the Dai Viet, among others. But these official histories have a few things in common. First, several of them were modeled after the Chinese one, with some modification. They were even written in Chinese characters. Second, they only pertained to the royal class and the elites. Commoners, peasants, anyone from the lower class that was not involved in the government was not featured in those histories, as Professor Sachishmit Hori from Dartmouth College describes here about pre-modern Japan.
When we read literature or look at historical documents, naturally they almost always pertain to elite class. It's very difficult to learn about what peasant day-to-day life was like, especially first-person account, right? Because people are not literate. People who are elite and literate created text, and then they were not necessarily interested in the lives of fishermen or, So we cannot know so much about people's gender identity. It's very difficult.
Indeed, how would we know anything about the commoners if all we have are the literature and historical records that pertain to the rich? And this is significant because sometimes the little information we do have from oral histories or other sources do paint a different picture. Take, for example, Iran. It turns out that the elite women had much more restrictive lifestyles that confined them to women-only spaces compared to rural women who were out working. Here's Niloufar Rassouli from the Zurich Institute of Technology.
So when we talk about homosocial women's spaces in Iran, there is so much generalization in defining or understanding them. So many of these urban infrastructures, they were mostly used by middle-class, urban, royal, high-class women. In the same country, in the same region, that maybe the middle-class women, they needed the permission of their husbands or their fathers to get out of their homes. And by this, I'm talking about maybe pre-1930s in Iran. In the same environment, when we were moving away from the center and moving away from the privilege, rural women, they were already out. They were showing their faces and they were working outside. There's so many layers to these stories, but we always come to know these words and these histories through the archival things that are remaining, and we also should know that archive is the practice of the privilege. So the marginalized voice had no way in archives, but it doesn't mean it did not exist.
Niloufar and I started talking in October 2023 when we were seeing Western media completely gloss over the devastation in Palestine as Israel's relentless bombings went unchecked. Before October 7, I knew about the Holocaust, but knew very little about Palestine. I decided to watch several documentaries about the Holocaust, the creation of Israel, what life was like in Gaza and the West Bank today, so that I could understand the different points of view. I also followed a number of Palestinian journalists in Gaza who were documenting the horrors that were happening every day. And yet the media in the West rarely showed that side of the conflict or any empathy for those who were being slaughtered by US-made bombs. It was already clear within the first few days that the West was going to write the history of this dark chapter like it does all the others where it has massacred or helped massacre large groups of innocent men, women, and children, whether that's Vietnam, Japan, Korea, or Palestine. I'm telling you this not because my guest today is Palestinian, not because this genocide has been on my mind every single day for the last year, but because what is happening now tells us about what probably has happened in the past, even if we don't have direct proof of it. In fact, that's probably why we don't have much to go on. Hegemony erases everything else. Here's Nilufar again.
If right now the whole memory is being changed and the history is being written by the one who has the power, then what about, for example, early 20th century Iran, that almost nothing is remaining, and the things that are remaining are very hegemonized. And if they are archived right now in Iran, if they're in the universities, libraries, etc., they are all closed, they are not indexed, we do not know. And if something was there during the revolution, 1979 revolution, so many things they were erased. Maybe we do not need necessarily a document to say something existed, but just observing right now and bringing these questions and observe and thinking that if something is happening right now, it could have easily also happened in the past. As a historian who is dealing with history at least for 10 years of my life, I'm always super scared because there's nothing. If I was doing the same research in the context of France, I was overwhelmed with the archival material. What do we want from history? Do we want to prove something? Do we want to add some other points to an already established line, as Sarah Ahmad says? Or do we even dare to question all the methods that history with capital H has been written, right? Based on evidence, based on archive, based on referring to big history. So to reject all of that and even dare to say that we are going to write a history of ourselves for ourselves, responding to our contemporary world with our critical imaginations of what could have happened in the past or what happened but never managed to come to the archive.
Indeed, archiving is the practice of the privileged. Most official histories are more preoccupied with rulers, military figures, battles, and scholars, maybe. It's hard to imagine an archive dedicated to the most marginalized, right? But what if I told you that there are such archives in India? An archive compiled by and about a caste-oppressed community. An archive so large that it almost seems too banal to matter. An archive so comprehensive, yet no official histories write about it. In many of the episodes, we've touched on the fact that scholars often don't have much to go on, especially for minorities of any kind. But is it possible that we got too used to the idea that we need to dig for information? That histories of sexuality and sexual diversity cannot possibly be easily available? Here's Professor Anjali Arundeka, Professor of Feminist Studies and South Asian Studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz.
What happens if we don't begin with loss? What happens if we begin not with an idea that our histories have disappeared, but rather that we have been trained to think that they have disappeared when they are always already there? I looked at a collectivity which I was raised in, is a collectivity of Devadasis. Devadasi is a Sanskrit term that means slaves of God and is often interchangeably understood as prostitute, sex worker, and courtesan. Now, this community called the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, which moved between Portuguese and British India, was a community that archived its own histories, which is very counterintuitive, right? Because we assume, well, if it's a minority community, there's no way these people have their own history because they were repressed or they didn't think about it, etc. Now, this community has been around from the late 19th century and continues to this day and have kept their records through that time. Every month, there is a periodical still published. Well, here's a community that has a history of sexuality that is available, under which ages I grew up. Why hasn't this history been written? And the reason why the history wasn't written is, again, because we are used to a story of loss. When we have something that is available, it doesn't seem as if it is desirable. So here is the paradox, right? We want histories of sexuality, but we want them through certain ways of reading, meaning we want them to be disappeared, we want them to be oppositional in a certain way, and we want them to be available to us through difficulty. The challenge is, how do we think of histories of sexuality not as erased or lost or disappeared, but rather as always already there? And how do we find archives, perspectives, voices, images, sounds to bring those back into our view? What we are learning, for example, from Indigenous scholars, from First Nation scholars, and from other queer and trans and sexually variant communities is that these histories are available and voiced in different ways, not necessarily through text, but sometimes through oral histories, through memories, through cultural production, through music. What if we begin with a notion that there is so much for us to read, rather than from the notion that there is very little for us to find? It may be a small change in perspective, but analytically, it leads to very different places.
In Vietnam, we can see a rather stark contrast between the official policies of the country and how the rich people lived versus how people in rural towns and villages lived and their attitudes towards sex. While the elite subscribed to Confucianism, many of the villages had much more sex-positive attitudes. Reminder, Confucianism, very sexist. The official records, which mostly document the lives of the elites, depict very sexist and restrictive attitudes. Women had to remain virgins until they married, to ensure offspring of elite status. See episode 4. Poetry and legend from the villages, on the other hand, are a lot more fun. Here are a few folklore poems that show just that. To be pregnant without a husband reveals cleverness. To be pregnant after marriage demonstrates commonness. Here's another one. A flirtation is not a mistake. A virtuous woman is hardly something to worship. And one more. Be a playgirl to the fullest. Then you can marry a serious man. Be a playgirl until you're tired of it. Then you'll be serious enough to marry. There's also a legend about the woodcut folk paintings of Dong Ho village. These are carved onto wood and printed on paper. They're unique to the village and are generally bought and displayed around the new year. The story goes like this. There was once a talented wood carver in the village, and the village heads commissioned him to make decorative panels for the communal house. The artist carved girls bathing and using lotus flowers to cover their bodies, and boys touching their boobs. On Inauguration Day, the village elders summoned him and accused him of carving inappropriate images in a majestic place. The artist replied that the human body was created by God, so calling it inappropriate would be calling God inappropriate. He said people wouldn't know about sex or be able to enjoy it if it didn't come from God. All the villagers eagerly supported his arguments. The village elders had no comeback. So the panels stayed and became a popular tourist attraction. But because he made the elders mad, he was never hired again to decorate communal houses. So he began to carve his work on persimmon wood and printed them on paper for sale, and that's how the Dong Ho paintings became a thing. When stories of queerness weren't in official histories, sometimes they were in laws and court documents. Using the legal system against its unfair laws is such a gratifying thing to behold. This next story shows how silly anti-queer laws are and how easy it is for smart people to expose this silliness.
Another wonderful story, and I think this is the best story ever, and I teach it all the time, is a story written by a wonderful feminist writer named Izat Chugtai, which was written right before Indian independence, and the story is called The Quilt. She was a very famous author, and she wrote this wonderful story, which was about this young girl who goes to stay with her aunt, and her aunt lives with this very dissolute, kind of rich ruler type who has a lot of young boys running around him all the time. It's written from a child's perspective. She also notices that her aunt, who's also a little bit bored, has a woman who comes in to give her a massage every day. So the story continues, and again, there's nothing being said. And at the end of the story, it's a short story, the voice of the young protagonist says, I walked into my aunt's room and I noticed there was something happening under the quilt, because the massage lady was there and the woman was there. And she said, and I opened the quilt, and then the story ends there. When the story was published, the British colonial state and various other crazy right-wing people went after Izat Chugtai and said she was advocating lesbianism, which is a term that had just become popular because in 1890s onwards, there was a discourse called sexology. So all of these terms like homosexual, lesbian, onanite, all of these things were becoming popular. Now, Ismat Chughta's lawyer and Ismat Chughta did a brilliant thing, because one of the reasons why she was called up in the courts was because they were saying she's advocating lesbianism and there is no lesbianism in India. That was the argument that the conservative side was making. This is where the resiliency and humor comes in. She was being called up on obscenity charges. And a lawyer said, well, if there's no lesbian in India, or if there are no lesbians, how do you know what she saw under the quilt? Right? In order for you to condemn something, you need to know what it looks like, right? So they were hoist by their own petar. So there are many, many stories like this, which is, on the one hand, I'm going to say, I don't know, this doesn't exist. It's part of Western culture. So the British would say, well, there's no sodomy, there's no sodomites in our culture. It's all in the other Oriental cultures. But then again, they passed many, many laws to condemn sodomy, right? So why would you pass a law and why would you get so worked out if it's something that doesn't exist, right? That's always the contradiction.
Another way people resisted the anti-sodomy laws implemented by the Brits, see episode 6, is sowing reasonable doubt. If you're eating, I suggest you fast forward about 90 seconds right now. The following story contains mentions of forensic medical examinations and unpleasant GI issues.
A story that happens in the late 19th century, in the 1880s, where in northern India, there is a man or someone who seems like a man dressed in women's clothes who is arrested because this person is seen as cross-dressing or creating some kind of disorder. I'm using the word he because that's the pronoun that the record uses. He is taken to the jail, and a forensic pathologist examines him and finds out that he has a distended anus. So these details are in some ways horrifying, because you're learning about a person without learning about their identity, but learning a lot about their bodily details, right? The forensic person says, well, look, he has a distended anus, so he must be a habitual sodomite, which means that he's had a lot of anal intercourse. But then somebody else comes along, his lawyer and other discourses come along at the time, and they say, well, there's a massive famine going around at the time in the same area, and he may have a distended anus because he's had dysentery and has been going to the bathroom a lot, right? So all of the ways in which sexuality is persecuted or pathologized, if you look at many of these stories, there are always alternative stories being produced.
Having clearly defined rules can also mean that if the situation isn't clear, they can't rule against you, right? And we humans are always so creative. I love that for us. Yay, reasonable doubt. What I also love is that no matter how awful the official laws may have been, there have always been allies who have helped our queer ancestors navigate the world a little bit easier. The lawyers in these two stories are perfect examples. In the Vietnamese legend, the villagers backed the artists whose carvings were condemned by the officials. In the last episode, we saw how female poet Wu Cao was able to infiltrate male-only spaces as a well-respected female poet, lyricist, and playwright, and even got her poems featured in an anthology put together by an all-male poet society. Her mentors and her peers were also examples of allies. And I think it's because when you know someone personally, no matter your differences of opinion, if you truly get to know someone in all their complexity, it's really hard to hate them. It's really hard not to witness the struggles they face navigating a world that wasn't built for them, and not empathize and try to help if you can. In episodes 2 and 4, we talked about how men and women in Iran were dehumanized by Orientalist tropes. They were thought to be incapable of love, even straight love, because they didn't show love the way Westerners did at that point, even though love marriages were still relatively new in Europe at that time. But the narrative around how Iranian wives didn't know how to love their husbands or how Iranian men loved other men was repeatedly used to other them and justify, quote-unquote, civilizing them. Here's Niloufar Rassouli again.
We are talking about a long history of knowledge production of the West over the East, with the centrality of Islam in it, in the names of supremacy, of showing that the Oriental is incapable of imagination, knowledge, reason and rational thinking, so it's better for the Oriental to be ruled by the West. To go back to our queer histories, unfortunately, we have no choice but going to colonial and Orientalist archives. And when we go there, this is the framing of any kind of intimacy. I think for any attempt to decolonize our understanding about our queer histories, we first have to understand or decolonize the way we have understood the practice of love and intimacy in our own communities. Who has the right, or who comes to say what love should be? Or this understanding of a nuclear family, where did it come to our cultures? Which one of our writers wrote love to be a practice of a man and a woman, a middle class woman and a man having a house? Who said the love should be like that? In Persian and Turkish literature, the two languages that I know, it is impossible to find love like this, but the love is mostly written as a process very close to Sufism. So I think it's really important if we want to imagine anti-colonial frames of understanding a queer past to liberate ourselves and our futures. I think we first have to listen to the past, listen to the history, but try to decolonize and in the quest for anti-colonial stories of love. We do not necessarily have to search for queer or lesbian or gay examples of love. If we only can liberate love from all of these rhetorics, I think so many new lines of storytelling would emerge from that.
This echoes what Professor Arundekar said earlier, that starting from a place of abundance rather than a place of loss can open up new and surprising ways to get to a more inclusive, pluralistic past.
How can an empty archive be full? When you say, well, I'm working on histories of sexuality of the 19th century, the response is, well, how could you be doing that? There are no records. In colonial British archives, particularly in India, there is an efflorescence of archives and references to sexuality, but they are always folded into things like sodomy statutes, records of sexual deviance, records of child marriages, all of these ways that pathologize sexuality.
There are so many resources to draw from, and some of them might surprise you. Take, for example, porn. Yes, I said porn. If I told teenage you that porn is history, you might have raised an eyebrow wondering if this is my conspiracy to get you to sign up for AP history. I don't blame you. You couldn't pay me to take history in high school. However, it turns out that we can learn some useful information about the history of gender and sexuality through porn. And it's been around for a long time. Okay, perhaps a better term would be erotic art. You know what I mean. In China, for example, Professor Tunsun Wu shared this.
The Chinese pornography, the painting, usually in traditional form, there are 12 pages, very beautiful painting. You can see it in Boston Museum, in San Francisco's museum. There are 12 pages or 24 pages. If it's 12 pages, there will be at least one about same-sex love. If it's 24, there are at least two. People thought that is appropriate because they thought you can't exclude the same-sex love from pornography because it existed.
Yep, pre-modern Chinese porn always featured at least some gay sex. This tells us that it was mainstream enough that it was expected to be represented. And the fact that it was there wasn't a turnoff for the rest of the audience, clearly. In Japan, we talked about two types of erotic images in this series. One was the shunga in episode 2 that were the how-to manuals used to market sex toys, and those included lesbian sex toys. These manuals were also dubbed as laughing pictures, and laughing was a euphemism for masturbation. There were also ads for love hotels that welcomed same-sex female couples at the time, so altogether these tell us that there was female-female love at that time that was relatively well known and accepted to some degree. The other type was the Chigo tales, which were the tales of the Buddhist acolytes and their love affairs with the Buddhist monks who were enamored of them. The Buddhist acolytes were teenage boys, and from those tales we learn that these boys, the Chigo, were revered. They got to pick who they wanted among the monks, and their affection was highly sought after by the monks. They were the BTS of the monastery. Everybody wanted their attention. The monks had to court them, and these good-looking teens were calling the shots. And if those scrolls are any indication, they were some horny teens. Sometimes, porn could be an entryway to so much more about history.
So the challenge for me was, how do you take a genre like colonial pornography, where the only way you see brown or black men are as oversexed, rapacious beings, right? So how do you look at colonial pornography? And instead of focusing on that story, how do you look at things like, for example, the India rubber dildo, right? Which is an object that appears in a lot of colonial pornography. And rather than it being about dildos and what they do, it becomes more about the fact that India rubber was like the silicon of the 19th century. And the British used it to make all kinds of things after the Crimean War, to make prosthetic limbs for soldiers who came back. So sexuality becomes more of a kind of kaleidoscope from which you can learn about a whole range of things. So the idea that an archive is empty because we don't have explicit accounts of people who call themselves queer is not necessarily a way to arrive, because that would limit what you know.
We also talked about other types of erotic arts that weren't exactly porn, but that depict sex as a natural daily activity. Like the sculptures in India, the engravings on bronze jars in Vietnam, gods taking the form of genitals in South and Southeast Asia in episode 5. All of these are not necessarily official records of history, but they do tell us bits of information about what may have been on the minds of those that came before us. Although in recent years, the LGBTQIA+ discourse has become more mainstream, queer folks today are living in a time of chaos under hostile governments where their voices are often suppressed. Even in the West, the US positions itself as a safe haven for queer folks, yet anti-queer hate crimes were up 19% from 2021 to 2022, and anti-trans hate crimes were up 35% over the same period. What is true is that official policy doesn't always reflect what happens on the ground at a more granular level. Conversely, even in the most unlikely places, there are always people who are welcoming, as our co-host from episode 3, Tony, shared about their experience touring in the South.
This is totally anecdotal, and I'm not discounting trans violence that happens all over the country. It exists. But in my small time traveling America, presenting femme in a perceived masculine body, I've gotten so many compliments more than weird looks in like the middle of nowhere. In places I would have never thought, deep in the South. Like, oh, you're so beautiful. I'm like, that's sweet. And obviously that's anecdotal, but it just demonstrates that like at the end of the day, a lot of Americans just want to be kind to each other. They are looking at the good in people a lot of the time. And gender is a tool of oppression that people in power use to fearmonger at this moment. Because generally the individual, they don't really care.
Similarly, as we'll hear from Izat shortly, not all Muslim communities or families are anti-queer. It is also true that official policies can conflict with each other. Gay marriage is legal and federally recognized in the US, and that's great. But almost half the states have no ban on conversion therapy. Translegislation.com has counted 661 anti-trans bills introduced across 43 states in 2024 alone. Of the 661 introduced, 45 have passed, 491 have failed, and the rest are still up in the air. So if our present is so fractured, why on earth would our past not have been equally chaotic? And with that, I'll leave you with the words of Professor Arundeka, who says that desire cannot be contained.
I think the most beautiful thing about doing historical work is that everything is in chaos. And everyone who's assembling these archives knows that things don't make sense, but they keep trying to create stories that allow you to make sense of them. And that's how sexuality works, right? Desire cannot be contained. It is promiscuous, it meanders, and it lands wherever it lands. So the challenge for us is, how do we tell that story? You tell that story by beginning with the possibility of multitude,
In a moment, I will bring back our co-host, but before I do that, I would like to thank you for being a listener. This project has been a labor of love, a ton of work, but also incredibly inspiring. If you have been enjoying this series, it would mean so much if you were to show your appreciation either by leaving a review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to now. You can also subscribe on Apple. I also have a Substack, which I will link to in the show notes, where you can subscribe for $5 a month or $50 a year. I do all of this work for free. I'm not getting paid to do this. And it does take a lot of time and resources. So if you want to help me continue doing this work, any contribution would be much appreciated. Okay, on to our discussion. First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me. What went through your mind when you read the script?
A lot of things and things that I engage with in my day-to-day life, honestly, as a queer person. I really love the description of the spaces that we live and inhabit in our day-to-day life. So, for example, we're talking about schoolyards, we're talking about the city. And that reminded me also in the same script when they talk about being loved. I related to it so strongly by just remembering that as a queer Palestinian, I actually have fallen in love and crushed on someone while in middle school as a teenager, and that carried on even through middle school as high school as well. And that just reminded me that this is something that sometimes the rest of the world, as they talk about Palestinians and queer Palestinians in particular, we forget that these are experiences that they also go through, and they are very typical, like just the rest of the world and any queer Palestinian would. It's almost universal, this one-sided love that some queer people experience, right? The fact that we can always find ourselves in these situations where we are interested romantically, sexually in the non-queer people. And that was just something that I completely saw in that first script.
Any particular stories in the script other than that would like to comment on?
Yeah, I also really love the one titled Other Sources Than Official Histories. I definitely can relate to that we should go beyond the dominant mainstream narratives of history. And specifically, I love the phrase that they described history as something that is not isolated anymore. And the fact that our ability to research and access knowledge has definitely been reconstructed as well. And I think that this is something that we have seen in the recent years in the queer Palestinian context. And honestly, the whole SWANA region and the Arab queer context in general, where a lot of people are realizing that we can bridge some gaps. And based on that renovated idea of what knowledge and research can be, it's almost like we can rediscover ourselves and histories all over again. And I think that is really powerful.
Yeah, quickly for listeners, in case you're not familiar, SWANA stands for Southwest Asian and North African.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I want to go to your story. When did you first realize you were different, and what was it like for you as a kid?
I think I've always known that I was gay as early as I can remember. I was definitely more of a flamboyant kid. I connected more with the feminine world. I even loved playing with girls' toys as a child, dressing up in a feminine way. I have some very vivid memories of my childhood where some of my older cousins who were already married and much older than me, trying to either be very supportive of it or trying to prevent it from happening. I think it was a very typical kind of childhood queer gay experience in this way. I was also definitely bullied as a middle school kid, but what I will say that was different about it is that it happened due to what was represented as an odd pattern of masculinity. It was not labeled as homosexuality, as in the kids that were around in my middle school, I don't think they even knew what the word is, which I think that is something that since then has definitely changed in Palestinian society.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I also would say that definitely is very similar to a lot of queer kids' experiences. But even then, we still don't get the chance as Palestinians to experience that and even talk about it because our narratives and the narratives of the world around us are so limited because of the conflict, because of the wars, because of the colonial realities that we have always experienced, is that we just don't think that even though bullying is awful, it's just something that queer Palestinians experience as well, just like everybody else.
Yeah. You've mentioned in several articles that I've read that Palestinian culture can be very homophobic. I want to say I really hesitated to talk about Palestine at all in this series because I was very worried that it would be used against Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
Pinkwashing. So I'm so glad that you're here so we can talk
Yeah.
about it. When was the first time you felt safe to tell someone?
I do have a lot to say about this abuse and exploitation of this potential episode, like on your podcast, being used against Palestinians. So I will hold on my thoughts on that. But to your question about when was I comfortable telling anyone, I think it was almost at the end of my high school. The first person I told was a counselor slash social worker, psychologist who worked with a group of students at my high school. She was a Palestinian Arab from the region, and she was very supportive, understanding. I think she just had a personality that made me think that she would understand. So for me, it was as early as that. And then my cousin also knew in a matter of a few months after that. And then in the year to 2 years right after high school, while I was in college, only 30 minutes away from my town where I grew up, I had been exposed at that point to Palestinian queer organizations, El Qaus, which stands for in Arabic rainbow, and Aswat, which means voices. Both were queer and feminist Palestinian organizations. I also got exposed and communicated with Israeli Jewish communities as well, just because sometimes they were more accessible to me, being more in the south of the Palestinian Israeli region, where those Palestinian groups were a bit further drive-wise for me. But then even being in those Israeli Jewish spaces, unfortunately, even though I shared the queerness with them, a lot of times it just felt like I was the Palestinian or the Arab. I didn't feel fully included. I couldn't really relate to a lot of the discussions that were happening there. So at some point, I cut ties with these groups and just started building my own communities and so on. And then a lot of the people in my town, a little bit after that, including some of the people I went to high school with, they know. Some were more accepting than others. But that guy that I mentioned earlier that I crushed on in middle school, he also knew at that point. And since then, he was probably one of the very few people that I really had to cut ties with. But besides that, I want to be clear that this experience of safety, telling people and coming out is also very common, typical, mediocre, even in terms of the coming out experience, where it comes at odds or almost like contradictory to what a lot of people who are not Palestinians imagine about what the Palestinian coming out experience could be like, because we limit it to violence and death just because there is that occasional piece of news that you see in the Western media that essentially, honestly, romanticizes our death and our violence as if this is the only thing that we could possibly experience. But I haven't experienced any of that. So speaking of safety and telling people, I know that I'm not the only person who
Yeah.
has gone through a similar story. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of variety of these stories.
For sure. So you grew up in Israel. What was that like? Was your neighborhood all Palestinian? Was it mixed? And what has been your experience living in Israel?
I grew up in the south in a town called Ksaife. It's a 30-minute drive from the Dead Sea in the desert. It was entirely Palestinian, Arabic speakers. I had a few Jewish, Israeli, Hebrew speaker teachers here and there who did not speak Arabic. Some of my middle school and high school education sometimes meant that I had to drive a town or two over for some education and programming. But for the most part, it was in an entirely Palestinian environment. I did speak Hebrew just because it was part of the reality of life around us, but also culturally, ethnically, it was 100% Palestinian space.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
You've also shared in some of your writing that your family has been very loving and supporting, which is contrary to a lot of stereotypes people have about Muslims. Tell me more about your family's reaction to queerness.
I initially started by telling my sister in a long message slash email because I knew she would be more understanding, and she was. I wouldn't say exactly, okay, whatever, no matter what. She seemed to be a bit concerned about it. But then again, she was just like, nothing happened really. And then at some point, I would say 2 years after that, I told my other cousin, and he is close to one of my siblings. So I told him to tell my sibling. And then from there, I asked them to just tell everybody else. And just for the record, I actually am one of 12 siblings. Two are half siblings. So that's a lot of people to be coming out to. It was a shock inducing experience, but it was not violent in any way. They tried to convince me that it's not okay, that we should correct course and all that stuff, which is typical and expected in a lot of families. But over time, not only did they understand and became more okay with it, I think that their anxiety it decreased. The reason they were really concerned was, first off, the fact that I may not have a family and kids of my own, which is huge to us Arabs and Palestinians in general. And then the other thing was just what would that mean for the community that I'm from? Because I may not be living right next to them right now, but they actually are part of the community, and their jobs and livelihood part of that community. So they were anxious about how could that affect them. And over time, we built the dynamics that have made it work for both me and them. Also, I'm an atheist, and they have known about that way before I came out. So when I did come out as queer, they just kind of, oh, that explains other things in my behavior, attitudes, and whatnot. I also think a big part of it was my male privilege, in the sense that when I was a young adult, I was able to leave the house. Nobody questioned me too much. And I just feel like it would be weird not to acknowledge that I do also have male privilege in this context as well. And that allowed me to build the community that I wanted alongside my family before I became fully comfortable with my queerness in public. I was never really pushed to be religious in any way, even though my family is devout Muslims. They pray 5 times a day. They fast the whole month of Ramadan and all of that. But it was still never in our family something that you're just like forced to really do.
And I think that's something that too many people in the West don't understand or don't want to understand, that the narratives that we have around Islam are terrorist, extremist. And I'm like, there's just as many extremist Christians. What are you talking about? I'm an atheist too. So I'm like, I would be cool if we drop all the religions, but if you want to keep yours, it's cool. Just don't force it on anybody else.
I agree. I am fully there with you. Absolutely. Yes.
Since we're talking about these rhetorics, maybe we should talk about the question of pinkwashing. I've been reading this excellent book called Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique, in which he talks about how queer Palestinian activist circles, there's like a tension between the struggle for Palestinian liberation from Israeli occupation / genocide and the struggle of queer Palestinian liberation from some of the Palestinian patriarchy, queerphobia, and trying to deal with all of that and the pinkwashing and everything. And based on the articles I found, you've shared some frustration in that sometimes it feels like the queer Palestinian movement has to take the back seat. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk about that. And we can also talk about how we hope this episode will not be weaponized against the Palestinian community.
I mean, we can be clear that by having this discussion, the point is not to attack the queer Palestinian movement, because I am very much pro their work and I am an advocate of them, and I will always speak positively on their behalf. I also realize that whatever I have been saying when it comes to that has been a double-edged sword kind of situation, where a lot of queer Palestinians themselves, when they hear an opinion like mine, they just assume that I am anti-Palestinian, and or when Westerners who have Orientalist homophobic tropes just use that as a way to justify pinkwashing. But neither is true. What I have been arguing when it comes to pinkwashing is that, unfortunately, we should also be thinking how to live our daily lives and our day-to-day needs while we are living under occupation and while we are experiencing colonization. We should be resisting, we should be continuing with the struggle, but at the same time, until that is achieved, what do we do until then with other internal issues and struggles that are relevant for us as a culture, as a society? And to me, that critique came from two places. First, the fact that queer Palestinians as a community are diverse people. So whether it's socioeconomic levels, religion, beliefs in everything, lifestyles, professional pursuits, they are more diverse than people think they are, because we're not this one group where people just say Palestinians and like as if we don't have any disagreements at all. So that would be one thing. And then the other thing is that I've noticed that there were some needs on the ground in our communities that could have been addressed. There were channels and venues that could have been used to potentially go beyond just the effort of dedicating all of the resources and energies just to pinkwashing. For example, there is an issue and a shortage of sexual health services, or I don't know, education that could be potentially resisted in one way or another, because there were enough allies that we could have used to help us build some sort of effort that could allow us to bring LGBTQ conversations into all other spaces, public lectures, and so on. And these things have been happening. It's not that they have not. My critique has been more, we should balance out where the energy and the resources go, instead of just making it an entirely only decolonial process, in the sense that we're only focusing on the big beast, the major problem, which it is a major problem, but then we're also living our own lives as well. And this is a conflict that has been going on now for 76 years, if not more. So what, should we just halt our lives? Yeah, so that's what I really have been critiquing.
Yeah, that the liberation of queer Palestinians should not be contingent on the liberation of Palestine per se, but it should help it, right? Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It should recruit itself for it. I'm all for that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we should also be thinking about our own selves as a small community and a minority within our own society and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the title of that essay had something to do with intersectionality. And intersectionality has been a central part of this podcast, as our struggles are all connected at the end of the day. But you did say very convincingly, and I really agree, that sometimes we get a little bit too into the weeds and lose the plot.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And ideally, every movement would lift up its most marginalized. So ideally, the Palestinian liberation movement would also be uplifting queer Palestinians in its movement. Unfortunately, on the ground, that doesn't always happen this way. Mm-hmm. And also, sometimes activist lingo, while accurate, can be a turnoff that fails to humanize queer Palestinians to their own people. It seems like maybe that queer liberation movements are trying to replicate queer liberation movements that started in the West in contexts that are not Western, and it's not translating to the local context. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. When I think intersectionality, as someone who actually teaches about it, we do have to acknowledge that it all started from the context of African American women in particular, who had to face both sexism and racism at the same time. And it has been such a powerful tool for African American women. Other people and other groups of grassroots mobilizing movements and whatnot have tried to adopt it as well. In some cases, I found that it was useful, in others, not so much. I think that in the Palestinian context, while it helped the Palestinian queer movement frame its own vision and narrative, we should have not just stopped there. We should have added more to it, because let's face it, the connection between occupation, colonization that Palestinians experience and queer liberation, to create that connection to the ordinary Palestinian is such an intricate process that unless you're an intellectual sitting somewhere on a fancy campus, that may not even make sense. And even explaining complicated phrases such as homonationalism and pinkwashing and intersectionality in and of themselves, these for the public are not really easy and comfortable to explain. So at the same time, Palestinians are very attached to their Palestinianhood. Many of them, unfortunately, not many, I should say some of them, have been for years attaching homosexuality to Western narratives and Western colonization. Why would they embrace it if it's presented to them through their most precious identity, which is them being Palestinians?
Yeah.
So that is where I think strategically, it's not that I'm actually against it. I'm
Right.
more, when I'm thinking about activism being a strategic approach, that we should be intentional with our decisions and how we present ourselves to our own communities, that is where I had disagreements.
Yeah. How do you make it translate in a way that people get it? The whole reason I wanted to do this series was what you just said, where a lot of our Asian cultures believe that queerness is a Western invention, when in fact, the Westerners are the ones that made it taboo in a lot of our cultures. And that was why I wanted the series to exist, to be like, hey, just so you know, this was completely fine before.
Yeah.
I definitely get what you're talking about, because I grew up in Mauritius, which is a tiny African island. And when I left high school, queerness was not a conversation that was happening at all. I'm trying to imagine me as I talk about queerness today. And if I were to just go there when I was in high school and have this conversation with people, they would look at me like, what the hell are you talking about? Because, first of all, what are those terms? And then they don't even know what queerness is. What does that even mean? What does queer mean? What does trans mean? What does asexual mean? There's so much awareness that needs to happen before we can start talking about how things are co-constituted.
Agreed, absolutely. And it's not because we are underestimating our own communities and their ability to learn.
No, not at
It's more
all.
that, yeah, a lot of people think that just because this is what we think these days in our own cultures, this is the only version in which our cultures have ever existed in relation to queerness. And this is something that I really seek to dismantle all the time. In order for us to really uncover those histories of our communities prior to colonialism and the fact that homosexuality and queerness were normal prior to their intervention, we still need to bridge and build some things that can allow for this process to happen. We do have a responsibility, in my opinion, the ones who have existed along these lines of both Western intellectualism, but also our own intellectualism and our own cultures, knowing both histories and having lived in both places. I think that makes us also responsible for closing this gap.
Yeah, it's not that they can't get there, is that we need to facilitate. We need to remove the barriers. We need to make it easier. And it doesn't make it easier if we start at the language that activists are familiar with.
Yeah.
And if they don't know what we're even talking about, how would they care?
I agree.
Yeah.
We need to convince them that we're actually on the same team and we are members of the same culture, and our differences and diversity do not necessarily do us a disservice.
Yeah. And when people really know you as a person, no matter what their biases are, no matter what they've been taught to believe about queerness, if they know you as a person and they care about you as a person, chances are they will be more flexible than what you might think they are, right? It's just sometimes people just haven't been exposed to queerness and they don't really know what to make of it. And if we don't meet them where they are, how can we expect them to get there?
I actually have some really good examples of that, because some of my interviewees, when I did my research for my current book project, in which I have interviewed 55 LGBTQ Palestinians, a lot of the people that I talked to, when I asked them about their family's experience, how they perceived their queerness, a lot of them said that they don't even consider their families homophobic, just because their homophobia came from an actual, legit place of lack of knowledge. And they showed me how the process for them was like when they basically just had to re-educate, or not even re-educate, only educate, because there was no education to begin with on that topic at all. But once these families have become more informed, they actually became more capable of embracing their queer family members. And this is something that, again, I wish more people would know and be aware that this is something that happens, because that too contradicts that Western vision of us as Arabs, who are supposedly only strictly homophobic and there is no place for debate in our communities about it at all, when in fact I've heard multiple stories that showed that in a negotiation process and an education process with our own families and communities, some things are possible to change.
Yeah. For a lot of queer folks, especially non whites, finding queer ancestors can be very meaningful. Do you have some queer historical or fictional figures that inspire you from Palestine?
Yeah, so I was actually introduced to queerness in classic Arabic literature when I was 19 in a lecture that El Qaus, the queer Palestinian organization, organized when I was still back home. And it was a lecture by a queer Palestinian professor of Arabic. And he gave a detailed, beautiful account of how queerness appeared in Arabic classic literature. And that was the first time that I have experienced what we would call today a queer reading of a text or of a context, which is something that he brought up in the scripts that you shared today. In this classic context of Arabic literature, these are names that I have read their work even as a high school student in my Arabic literature class, but I never knew they were queer in any way. So being exposed to them right after high school in a whole other way was really a fascinating experience that proved to me that there were always conversations about queerness in the Arabic speaking world, in the history of literature and other ways of the Arab world. So I do want to give some names of people who openly talked about queerness in their poetry, in their literature. Some of these include Abu Nawas, Abil Baghel, Yazid bin Muawiyah, and El Khalifa El Amin. These are names that lived in multiple stages of the Arab speaking world, whether it's the Umayyads, the Abbasids, or the Andalusians, who also were the Muslims who made it as far as Spain at some point as well. What was beautiful about this literature is that it was so specific to the point that some of the discussions in it actually would even be inappropriate to the very open, sexually liberated Westerners in our world nowadays. They had explicit sexual descriptions and preferences. For example, they had some comparisons of bearded versus unbearded men, meaning the young men who are at the limit between being an advanced adolescent versus a young adult, or that some of them admired young men to the point that they actually compared them to young women, in the sense that they said these young men will always be way more sexually satisfying to them. And that is all in literature and poetry that actually has been taught in the Arabic speaking world for years. And these are names that almost every Arab who has gone through a K-12 Arab education would know, even though they may have not been aware of the queer connotations that appear in those works in any way. And I will also say that even though this may be distant back into the past of the Arabic speaking world, there are also some present day bands, music, movies, and culture that is being produced. So I would be happy to give an example, such as the band Mashrou' Layla, which unfortunately has disbanded for a while now, but they were an openly queer band that talked about queer issues, justice issues, political issues, and the lead singer and one of the vocalists was also queer. And in today's music video culture of the Arab world, there are also many subtle messages that appear that show that there is actually some acceptance of queerness. And I can also give some examples of artists in the Arab world who nowadays have been pro-queer openly. So for instance, we have Elisa, Jad Shweri, Carol Smaha, and others who have very much open about it and have been supporting queer people publicly. So this is more at the celebrity level, maybe ancestors level, but also I have met enough Palestinians right after high school who showed me that they can be a support enough system for me and allowed me to feel some sort of connectedness and groundedness with being both Palestinian and queer. And most importantly, in this context, I think it's really important to realize that while the West may think that Arabs completely reject queerness, we cannot talk about visibility or invisibility in the Arabic speaking world without acknowledging that the issues of freedom of speech and freedom of expression in the Arab world are actually also rooted with the elites politically and socially, who are also allies with the West, who also control freedom of speech and freedom of expression across many areas, not just queerness. So once we understand that, we realize that we cannot really try to critique the lack of stories in the Arab world today or in the last few centuries, which it was only colonized. So it just feels like there's this gap where we either go to this very classic old literature, or we look at subtle messages that are existing in our world today. That doesn't mean that Arabs are homophobe or that we are lacking in pro-queer people. They are there. It's just that indirectly, neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism have been engaging with this lack of conversation. And also that reminds me that for a lot of queer Arabs, including Palestinians, the mode of invisibility sometimes is more useful than visibility. So a lack of documented history is not always necessarily a bad thing, because when we look at the last few decades of the Palestinian experience, which was more traumatic and rooted in colonialism and occupation and whatnot, a lot of the times queer Palestinians also faced by Israel's atrocities and facing threats by Israel itself, whether it's Israel threatening to out them to their families or recruiting them to become informants in its intelligence units against their own people. There have also been crackdowns against Palestinians since even the genocide started just in the past year that have also been affecting specifically Palestinian citizens of Israel. So to try to frame this discussion about where do we find stories or lack of stories should be done, but should be done carefully and not see that lack of stories as necessarily a bad thing, just because, again, we can also reinvent history, reinvent those stories, and become more mindful of the present, even if we don't have sufficient enough histories that may show that queerness has been normalized in our cultures before, just because we have learned from our past lessons that we can basically just archive more and dismantle the notion that archiving is only for the privileged or for the strong political and social groups. I love this question, but it also is a multi-nuanced one, and we should really be thinking about how to go beyond, like carefully seek stories, but also understand why there aren't as many.
Yeah, and that's definitely one takeaway I hope people take from this episode is the different ways we can think about history, about archives, about what is a legit source, right? And what does it say when something isn't in the archive? Why did it make it there? It's probably not that it didn't exist. It's more likely that it wasn't there for a reason.
Contrary to the conception that it's either you fully exist publicly following the Western concept of pride and being out of the closet and all that, this is not the only way to exist as a queer person. I firmly believe that in a non-Western society, there are other ways that we can exist as queer people. And that can include, first off, reminding ourselves that we are part of our communities, we are experts on them, and we come from them. They raised us, so we know how to negotiate our existence with them without having necessarily to rely on outside Western saviors and so on. So that would be one thing for me. The other thing would be that no matter how difficult and repressive an environment can be towards us, there will always be some people who will be brave enough, even though I really hate this word, but they are naturally out there and they resist the environment around them. And those few, even though they may be a minority, they end up being connecting dots that build communities in really beautiful ways. The other thing is that I learned, because of the lack of public space, let's call it, in a lot of our communities, when people find, even if it's one connection, that they can talk about their queerness experience and bond over queerness, that ends up meaning that not only will they get more connections through that person that they had just discovered, but also that they will really feel for the first time, possibly, that other people will protect you and your queerness and be there in your support. And there's more than one way to communicate with these people and even build our own language around our own existence in our communities in ways that can be safe and can allow us to compromise without having the need to choose between either our queerness or our communities, the general broader ones. And that is something that I've seen happen over and over again in Palestine, whether it was in the West Bank, whether it was Palestinians in Israel, East Jerusalem. So this is just something that I know happens, and I have seen it many times, and I have heard many stories that prove that it is possible.
Yeah. You mentioned a very important point, which is that living out your queerness doesn't have to look like the Western idea of living your queerness to the fullest. I think this is also true in Japan. The scholar I interviewed, Sashi Schmidt-Hori, she said in Japan, people don't really come out to people, not because they're scared, not because they're embarrassed, but it's because it's nobody's business. It's not a thing that people talk about. It's not necessarily that they will be ostracized. It's just not something you bring up with people you don't know.
Yeah. And I would even take this comment by this guest and say that this doesn't only apply to coming out and the concept of closet or even the concept of pride. It also applies to the whole rights discourse altogether, because the measure of legality and using legality to measure how progressive a society is in and of itself problematic. Let's just state that, just because even Western LGBTQ nonprofit international organizations that are concerned with LGBTQ rights, they come from the heart of the West, and they employ a Western notion of queer rights that is just not relevant for other cultures. And yet they use those scales to assess our cultures and write reports about our cultures when there is so much fluidity in our lived experience that cannot be captured by law and cannot be captured by the Western discourse, which, don't get me wrong, I am happy for Western queer people to having their own experiences, lives, whatever struggles that they have gone through and achieved for themselves. I'm happy for them, but that doesn't mean that we should be copying and pasting or replicating that very same discourse, which is why sometimes if I were to even look at a liberation kind of approach to queerness in Palestine, the law would not even be a thing that I'm interested in or bothered in. And I would not take the measure of how many people are out of the closet to just indicate how much progress has been achieved in Palestine when it comes to queer people, because I'm sorry, but that's just plainly irrelevant.
Yeah, I remember seeing a report recently by CNN, like a roundup of LGBTQ rights in Asia or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it goes through all the countries that have legalized or decriminalized sodomy or something to that effect, without mentioning the fact that the British put those laws in most of those countries, mm-hmm. or the French or some other Western power. So completely erasing that context. And then saying, oh, they still need to catch up to us. But I'm like, bro.
Yeah.
What happened 200 years ago?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I totally agree with you that this sense of morality has always been weaponized against the other. And that's Orientalism for you.
And we see this even in with the end of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. The Ottoman Empire, basically, queerness in it was actually pretty normal and common and public in a lot of ways. But then in the 19th century, they declined by effect of the Western colonization on them. But then when the Ottoman Empire basically died in 1923, as a result, the first Turkish president or prime minister, whatever we want to call them at that time, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, he basically was the first person to introduce the conservative approach to homosexuality and queerness as a method to stabilize the new emergent state that we now call Turkey, which is the remainder of the Ottoman Empire. So, and we, by the way, and we see something similar to that in the scripts that you shared, which is in the case of China, where when the Opium Wars ended, the result was that they started implementing more traditional or kind of other concepts that
what were seen as progressive at the time, which we now see as traditional, conservative,
Yeah.
now.
So the same thing happened with the Ottoman Empire immediately after it ended. What happened? But the thing is that when the British imposed those homosexuality laws, specifically in the case of Palestine in 1936, that happened alongside a process that meant that even after they had left the region, the Jordanian rule at the time stayed like following the British until 1951. And the Jordanians also had a say legally on the West Bank in particular, and all the rest of Palestine that was not at the time Israel proper. And that meant that they had to enforce it. But past 1951, not only did much later, when the Palestinian Authority emerged, there was no criminal code against homosexuality of any sort, but also it just means two things in this context: that not only did colonization bring these laws on us, but the fact that we cannot talk about the legality of homosexuality in Palestine without acknowledging that for a long time, most of it was the legacies of the legal foreign occupations that were in the region, whether it's the Ottomans, whether it's the British, whether it's even the Israelis, whether it's other groups, including in some ways the Jordanians as well. So this is something that I find a problem to ignore when it's just very much the most relevant context we should be talking about when we talk about supposedly the homophobic intrinsic nature that some Westerners ascribed as inherent to Palestinians, when it's way short-lived than homophobia has in the West.
Yeah. The narrative from the West is it's all because of Islam. And I'm like, I'm not so sure about that.
Agreed. Yeah.
So if younger you was listening to this episode, what would you hope he would take away from it?
I think I would tell him that it's possible to live in your community without having to feel the need that you have to choose between your queerness and being a Palestinian and the Palestinian family and community that you were born and raised in. To remember to not let anyone convince you that your community and family are unloving, because if anything, the community-based nature of Palestinians and Arabs is something that I would tell my younger self that this is something that you can weaponize for your own benefit, just because we are community people. We don't give up on our people easily, even over issues such as queerness. And I wish that I knew and believed in that when I was much younger, because when I was younger, I just thought that if I really want to live as a queer person, that means that I must leave my community. And I absolutely do not believe in that anymore whatsoever. And the other thing would be to remember that a family life that has some conflict is actually okay. And that doesn't mean that it's not loving you, or it's not embracing your view, or that it hates you enough that you may feel the need to cut ties with it. That is also something that I believed when I was younger and I don't anymore. And just remember, again, not to allow others to be in a position that they would frame your perception of your own community for you, because you should be in a strong, confident position to perceive your community and negotiate with it and engage with it, despite how challenging that can sometimes be.
Yeah. So true. I also have a very big extended family. My dad has 9 siblings. On my mom's side, my grandmother has a lot of siblings, so big family. And I honestly believe that if you have a family that has zero conflict, it's either you have a very small family or a family that doesn't talk to each other very often.
I agree.
What do you hope listeners take away from this episode in general?
To dismantle the notion that is very wrong that Palestinians are just a bunch of homophobes, because our lives are so much more than that. Our diversity shows that. I usually like to take the example of even immediately post-slavery here in the US. African Americans had to figure out how to move forward, and amongst them there were differences. And we can see that in scholars such as Booker Washington and Du Bois, who are amongst the biggest intellectuals in the African American community post-slavery, and there were differences amongst these people. So it's okay for us to disagree, because we are not one unified group. We are a culture, we are a group of people who are Palestinian, but also get to be different in their own ways. And then the other thing would be to join forces to help Palestinian liberation, knowing that queerness can be a good tool to discuss Palestinian liberation in general and to say no to the violence that Palestinians experience collectively. It doesn't matter whether they are queer or not. It's really as simple as that. This would be my message, really. And just to remember that despite the lack of representation on Palestinian queerness, there is joy in our lives and there is community in our lives. Our communities do love us. And also, Palestinian culture is not our enemy. It's not our problem, really. Right now, what Palestinians are facing is an occupation and a colonization. And as we speak right now, it is also a genocide that must end. So I wish the world would listen to join forces in the broader overall pro-Palestine movement that refuses to disconnect queer Palestinians from the overall Palestinian society.
For sure. Absolutely. Another thing that you mentioned was not letting people tell you that your community is bad for you. I think that's something that people should keep in mind in general about their personal relationships. It's like if you have a new friend that you really like, but that is distancing you from everybody else, chances are they're in a cult or, like something not cool is happening here.
I agree.
People should not be trying to take you away from people who care about you.
Yes.
Ever.
And that is something that when I was young, I was naive enough to think that I can only be happy if I disconnect, get away, and listen to other people who supposedly know me and my people better than me, but I was very much wrong.
Yeah.
And I do want to also add that I do wish people would amplify queer Palestinian voices on our own terms, right? Not just amplify them, but like listen to us, learn from us, hear our stories, our experiences, and go from there, repeating them while respecting our experience and knowing that it cannot be weaponized against us in the context of the colonization of our own people. I want to give just some examples of the joy that I have experienced as a queer Palestinian, because I think that this is important to shatter this idea that it's only misery and violence and homophobia and death. I have been to so many queer communities in the forms of workshops, lectures, community building events. I have interviewed people for my research that also allowed me to build community. There are amazing queer parties that Palestinians throw that I have been to, probably hundreds of those, and they are so much fun. Arabic music is amongst the best to dance to. So join these spaces and enjoy that life that queer Palestinians have beyond those stereotypes and this romanticized version of the Western mentality and media that we're only dying and suffering, because we are able to manage the two and experience some pain, but also some joy at the same time. And I'm not here to be delusional and say that it's all beautiful and roses and whatnot, but just to confirm to people that there are a lot of experiences out there that if you listen to them, you will see that there's so much more to us than labeling us as colonized or as Arabs or as terrorists or as homophobes. There is so many layers to our experiences that cannot be ignored.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. That was really fun.
Thank you all for listening to the end. I want to say a big thank you to our co-host for today, Izat El Amoor. Also, a huge thank you to all the scholars who contributed to this episode, including Professor Anjali Arundeka, Professor of Feminist Studies and South Asian Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Professor Tuntun Wu, Professor of Chinese Literature at the University of Hong Kong, Professor Satyashmit Hori, Professor of Japanese Literature and Culture at Dartmouth College, and Nilufar Rasuli, a doctoral fellow at the Zurich Institute of Technology. Research, writing, production, and music by me, Lazu. You can find the show notes, our guest's bio, and references for this episode at nuancespod.com. Also, next time will be our very last episode of this series, and I'm super excited because I'm bringing you somebody very special. In episode 6, we talked about anti-sodomy laws that were brought to the colonies by Britain. Mauritius, where I grew up, was one of them. My guest is somebody who played a key role in getting that overturned in the Mauritian Supreme Court just last year. Be sure to tune in for that. Until then, my name is Lazu, and I hope you'll join me very soon for another nuanced conversation.